Hi guys, welcome to this video on the Rhetoric Prof stream. This is largely intended for my classes, and this is a video about debate propositions, the types of propositions that there are, and their analysis. But if you're coming to this, sorry about that, if you're coming to this video for some other reason, hopefully you will also find it valuable and maybe learn a little bit about how debate propositions operate. So when we come to a debate, one of the things that we have to do is actually formulate a proposition for the debate. So sometimes when we're preparing for a debate, we kind of are thinking broadly about various topics, various issues that are going on in the world. You might say, oh, I'm really interested in talking about artificial intelligence, or I'm really interested in talking about the wage gap, or I really think we should talk a lot more about the role of humanitarian aid in the global economy. One of the things that I'll address in this video. All of those are really good topics to have conversations about and to talk and discuss about while you're preparing to think about how you want to have a debate. When we actually are going to set up the debate that we're going to have, we need to do something a little bit more precise, which is create a proposition. So sometimes you'll see, even in the public sphere, people will have debates around questions. Is space something we should explore? And then there are two sides, and one side says, yes, we should, and one side says, no, we shouldn't. Actually, questions don't make for good debates. It doesn't mean that you can't have a good debate around a question, because people can always say interesting things. But questions, unfortunately, sometimes lead to some messiness in how we approach the debate. What really are our roles? What are we supposed to do? And oftentimes they kind of rehash already realized positions in the public sphere debate around these things. And that's often why you see them in the public sphere, because people are there representing pretty standard positions. One of the things that's unique about a debate proposition is that it's not a question, it's a statement. And we see like one right here: digital technology is an aid to learning. That's the first one we'll talk about. And one side will affirm that proposition and says this proposition is true, it should be accepted, it's good, it has good consequences for us to consider. And then the other side, the con, the negative side, whatever we want to call it, the opposition will say we shouldn't accept this proposition. It's a slightly different gesture. And one of the reasons why it's important that it's in the form of a proposition is not only that it tells us what we need to do in the debate, it also becomes a guide for how to think about interesting and unique lines of argumentation we can take. Because if we think about, oh, is artificial intelligence good or bad? We kind of end up in the same old argument. But with a debate proposition, you might be on a side of a proposition which seems like you would say, oh, I'm against digital technology as an aid to learning, which means I'm going to say that Zoom classes are bad. But there might be way more and much more interesting lines of argumentation that you could take there, which could not come out of the regular debate that we've been having about whether or not Zoom classes are good. And we'll talk about that in a second. So first of all, there are, as you can see here, three kinds of the debate proposition. So these are all sentences, not questions. And these three kinds are fact, value, and policy propositions. Propositions of fact, value, and policy. These all have their place. They all give us slightly different debates. I would say that the fact and the value debates tend to be pretty similar. They're not too different from each other, but they have slight differences, and we can talk a little bit about what those are. And the policy debates tend to be very different, and we'll talk about why the policy debates are different when we get to that. So first, what's the difference between fact and value? In a proposition of a fact, what we're debating is this proposition a good description of our reality? Is this a proposition that we should accept as being true, as being reasonable, or something like that? Whereas in a proposition of value, we're not necessarily debating whether a proposition is a good description of reality, but whether the value that the proposition suggests, or the attitude that it suggests, is one that we should also take up. Should we think about things in a certain way? Should we feel about things in a certain way? How should we do that? And so even though probably you'll have similar kinds of argumentation in both debates, the judgment that we're trying to lead the audience to in both cases is a little bit different. So let's look at some examples. So under propositions of fact, I've created two. One is digital technology is an aid to learning. In the value version of this debate, I put Zoom. We could just say digital technology too. I just changed it up a little bit. Zoom is a bad platform for education. Now, these might seem to be pretty similar, but you could still claim, for instance, in the fact debate, that it is an aid to learning, even though if you think that there's still It's still not the best aid to learning. It's not. There might be better ways of learning. So you could still affirm the proposition that digital technology is an aid to learning, and actually also affirm the proposition that Zoom is a bad platform for education, which is kind of weird. It seems surprising that those could actually be both affirmed by the same person. But it is possible, even if it's not so likely. So what we're debating in the fact proposition there is, what should we understand as learning? How should we understand what aids learning, and what is the role that digital technology plays in that? And I could even start a speech in the debate with that, just kind of showing how I'm taking all of the terms of the proposition and I'm going to make arguments about all of those terms. And we'll do a little bit of analysis in the second half of this video to guide you through what you might do with the proposition once it's formulated. Let's look at two more to compare the fact and the value. So this one's about humanitarian aid. In the fact, we say U.S. humanitarian aid has impeded the growth of the economies of the global South. And in the value proposition, I would say the U.S. humanitarian aid has worsened conditions around the world. Okay, so in the fact debate, I could argue, again, that yes, it's impeded growth of the economies around the global South, but that hasn't worsened conditions, because maybe I think economic growth is not a good thing. Maybe I think not having economic growth is fine or even good. Why would I think that? Well, that's a topic for another video. But if someone were to think that, they can actually have really very different attitudes towards these propositions, even though we tend to think that those kind of go together, that if you're impeding growth, that's a worse condition. But that's not necessarily the case. So that's one of the things that's different about this. So in the fact version of this debate about U.S. humanitarian aid has impeded the growth, one of the things I need to think about is, well, how do we measure, or how do we understand what is economic growth? So what can we look at? What kind of evidence can we bring forward to show whether or not this growth has been impeded? And how can I assign responsibility for that impeded growth to U.S. humanitarian aid? And those might be very different kinds of evidence. So in the one case, I might say, well, let's look at the trends of GDP. Let's look at all of these, who is taking IMF loans. We can look at who's going to the World Bank. And all of this should suggest low growth in economy. Or we could say, look at the various sectors of the global economy and look at the sectors of the economies of these countries that accept humanitarian aid. They tend to be mostly agricultural compared to the global economies. This is not growth. This doesn't represent growth. But when I'm talking about who's responsible for this being U.S. humanitarian aid, I might add something to that and say, well, look at the trend of where these economies go from the point at which they accept U.S. humanitarian aid, and it's a downward slope. But maybe the evidence isn't that clear, which is to say, okay, there wasn't a lot of growth before, but there was a possibility of growth that has been impeded by U.S. humanitarian aid. It hasn't done what it's supposed to do. And that might end up being a moral argument of saying we could help the growth of these economies if we did something other than humanitarian aid. Okay. Whereas in the value debate, really what it is talking about is that this is a condition that is worse. And so I might use similar kinds of evidence to prove that. I might want to say, look, low growth is a bad condition because it leads to all of these situations for people that are bad. If you have a low growth economy, you don't have as much social mobility. Maybe it leads to more political or social instability. I might make all sorts of claims about what a low growth economy looks like or a no growth economy looks like. But the thing that I'm trying to get the audience to agree to is that this is a worse condition and that condition is caused by humanitarian aid. So similar kinds of arguments in both cases, but that final judgment that I'm trying to lead the audience to is a little bit different. And I might approach that judgment through different kinds of evidence or through different kinds of argument if I think it helps my case the most. Okay, so now let's move to policy, which is a little bit different. And a lot of debates tend to be centered around policy. And what do we mean by policy? We don't necessarily mean that it has to be a political bill. We're not necessarily going to say, oh, what bills are in Senate right now, or what's in the Knesset, or what's going on in Indian Parliament. We're not necessarily going to have to look to the bodies of government that currently exist and see what policies they're discussing. We could do that. That's totally fine. But one of the fun things about debate is we get to come up with our own policies. Really what a policy means in the context of debate is just a change to the way that things are. We should make some change. And so because we're making some change, it's a little bit different from the other kinds of debate. And it means that the roles for the two sides end up being a little bit more different than in the other kinds of debates as well. So here we would say something like, as a policy change, the institutions of higher education should offer a remote learning option for all courses. Now, why would I say that? I might have lots of different reasons why I think, what do I think problem does that solve? What problem does that address? Maybe I would say this doesn't have anything to do with the pandemic or the fact that people need more flexibility for the pandemic. The pandemic will be taken care of. We'll get the vaccine. Things will be fine. But we actually have learned from this that a lot of people who have disabilities have better accessibility when we have courses online. Or I could say the totally opposite. That might be a reason to oppose it. Say, no, this online remote access courses actually hurt accessibility for people with disabilities. So that could be why I propose this policy. I could propose it for a totally different reason. I could say remote learning is a different kind of learning, which is good for higher education, or it allows people who are working or doing other things to still be able to go to school. So it makes it more open to people from different classes. I could say all of those things in one debate, but usually in a policy debate, I want to say that there's one clear problem, one big problem that this policy is designed to address, and maybe it does other things along the way as well. So the second one we have here is the United States should transfer all humanitarian aid in the form of donated goods to debt relief or direct payments. So sometimes a proposition of policy will be formulated in a way where it actually gives you some choices as to how to proceed. We could say, oh yeah, we actually want to say all debt relief, or we actually want to say all direct payments. But oftentimes if it's framed that way, it's probably saying there might be a reason why you would want to do either. Because maybe there are some countries that don't have debt to the United States. And so in those cases, direct payments would be appropriate. That might be why it's in there. But it's really up to you. When you are the team that's on the affirmative or the government or the pro side in a policy debate, you get to decide what your plan is. How are you going to implement this policy? So the policy is framed in some basic way in that proposition, but you get to decide how you're really going to do it. And you can make it really general and just say we're going to do whatever the proposition says. Whatever that means, we can debate the details if you want, but we're really here. We just think it's a good principle. We think it's going to go this way. But a lot of times it's important that you show how you're going to do it. How is this going to be possible? Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so once we have these, we have our proposition, we have all these kinds of ideas about what we want to debate, we have it formed in a proposition, we're good to go to the analysis. Okay, so we have the proposition. What should we do with this proposition? So the first proposition is a proposition of fact, right? Just to refresh, this is like digital technology is an aid to learning, or U.S. humanitarian aid has impeded growth of the economies of the global south. So the first thing we might ask ourselves is, what is the meaning of the crucial terms in the proposition? Are they open to reinterpretation, redefinition, or different sets of examples? So if you go back up to these, what do we really mean by learning in this case? And how do we measure learning? And so a lot of times debates that are propositions of facts end up being a lot about definitions and how we understand certain terms and words. They tend to be a lot about language. It doesn't mean that there's not evidence or there isn't a place for something that's empirical there. But a lot of times, if we just go right to the empirical evidence without saying this, I might present you a huge amount of evidence about standardized test scores, saying, see, digital technology has improved standardized test scores. My opponents can get up and say, that's all well and good, but standardized tests are not a good measure of learning. That's not what we mean by learning. And so they argue with me at a different point. And if they win that argument, maybe they win the whole debate. And so I'm not prepared for the debate that they want to have. So I need to kind of make some claims as to why, if I think that standardized tests are a good measure of learning, what do I mean by learning? How do I imagine it? And how can that become appealing or persuasive or convincing to an audience? But we can say that for all things here. What does it mean to aid? Oh, I might say, okay, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it does the learning for you. It just means that it helps. And how do we understand that? Same thing with digital technology. All of these things can be defined, and that might be important for you to make arguments. These are opportunities for making arguments. Second thing we might say is, what examples or evidence will be most likely to move an audience towards my position on this proposition? So probably with this first one again, well, let's go to the second one. U.S. humanitarian aid has impeded the growth of the economies of the global south. We talked already about some of the evidence that we might bring in there about GDPs or IMF loans or things like that. But let's say that I'm on the other side of this debate. I'm against it and say, no, it hasn't impeded the growth. Maybe one thing I could say is, okay, my opponent showed you all of this evidence about the IMF, showed you all this evidence about GDP, but it's really wrong. There's a problem with GDP. The way that GDP measures growth is really based on OECD economies. It's based on industrial economies or developed economies. If we want to think about growth in the economy of the global South, we actually need to think about the number of people that are moving around. That really migration flows within the country are a good measure of growth. Urbanization is a good measure of growth. So if more people are moving to cities, this suggests growth. Now, that might not be a good argument. Someone might say, no, urbanization doesn't suggest that. Maybe it suggests famine. It could be just very much the opposite of growth. But you can offer a different approach to how we should understand this kind of evidence, and then therefore you would bring in the best evidence for your opinion. And finally, and this is true for all propositions, but we'll focus on it here with the fact propositions. You can tell the audience directly, what should you be deciding on in this debate? So you're going to tell the audience, your judges, because your audience are judges here, what is it that's important to decide about? If we see that students are able to have more or less expression of their ideas in the classroom through digital technology, that'll be what we decide on, because we think that that's the best way to assess whether something is an aid to learning. Because learning is not just about absorbing information, it's about being able to metabolize information and reapply it. And so that's what you're going to decide on. Or I could say, we want to say whether digital technology, we want to decide about whether it helps people make it through a curriculum. So whatever it is, I want to tell the audience, if I prove this to you, or if I show you this, if I convince you of this idea, that idea is the idea that wins this debate. And you're going to do that with this policy, or this proposition, excuse me. Okay, second, value. So when we look at a value proposition, we have some slightly different things that we might consider. We could consider all of these for any topic, because these are really just prompts for you to consider arguments. So any of them that are helpful, use them. But when we think about value propositions, we might say, what are the potential principles that are in play for either side of the case? So if we look at the value propositions that we have here, Zoom is a bad platform for education. What kind of principles might be here? Well, maybe I have a principle about education saying education has to be holistic. Education is not just about the intellectual, it's about the social, the physical, the emotional. And so what I want to show you in this debate is not just that Zoom doesn't do that. Zoom is bad at providing a holistic education, but that value, that education should be understood as a holistic proposition, that's a value that you and I share, or that's a value that if you don't accept it now, you should by the end of my speech for some reason. So you're thinking about those kinds of values. You could say, on the other hand, no, what we should really think about here, if I'm saying that Zoom is not a bad platform for education, is we should be thinking about education not just from the perspective of the students, but from the perspective of the whole community, which is students, teachers, and parents. And education is a facilitation of the values and the knowledge deemed important in a community. And so that's the value that I represent. I want to show you why Zoom is good, and maybe better in some ways than the classroom, of allowing for all of the stakeholders in education to communicate with one another. Okay. Here, when I talk about U.S. humanitarian aid has worsened conditions around the world, well, there's so many different values and principles that are open to this. But I'd say, well, what does it mean to be, what is quality of life? Maybe that's, how do we assess quality of life? And I want to talk to you about that value. Sometimes it might happen that in a debate or like this, which is about value, me and my opponent profess the same value, saying, yeah, we both believe that there's a good quality of life. That's what's really important. And in fact, we imagine quality of life in very similar ways. We really just disagree about whether it's the U.S. humanitarian aid that has worsened these conditions, or we really disagree about whether quality of life has been worsened. So it's not necessarily that you have to disagree with your opponents about value, but oftentimes that's a source of a lot of arguments, and maybe a source of a way of thinking about a debate in a different way than just kind of going right to the evidence that is most obvious for you. Okay, what else can we say? What will we use to weigh comparative judgments? So this oftentimes happens when we have different values. So let's say if we go back to this first one, we have that value of holistic education versus community education, or community as a kind of education as a value of a community. Sometimes we won't have to weigh them because they might kind of be compatible. But in cases where, let's say they're incompatible, where let's say we are in an Amish community that has a very particular view of how it wants to educate people, which might not include that broad holistic sense, something like that. How do we weigh those two values? So what we want to do is present a principle to the audience of what we should consider as most important. What's most important for us to consider here? So that's something we could do there. And then finally, how will we determine who is responsible in our evidence and examples? So if we hear this debate is really about responsibility, that it's U.S. humanitarian aid. So I could give you tons of examples, if I'm on the pro side of this, of why conditions have worsened around the world. And I spend all of my time telling you all this stuff, and you're totally convinced. And then my opponent can get up and say, oh, I agree with everything that they just said, except that none of that has to do with U.S. humanitarian aid. It has to do with some other thing. It has to do with financialization or environmental disasters or something. So it's really important in most debates to be able to make arguments about responsibility. Why is this not necessarily the cause, but an agent of responsibility? Who is more or less responsible, or what is more or less responsible? Because oftentimes responsibility is distributed amongst parties. So you want to think about that when you're approaching these kinds of debates. All right, now we go into policy propositions. And this is a little bit different because here the analysis for both of the teams is going to be different. And there's lots of ways that people have approached this idea of how you should analyze a proposition of policy. Some are way more detailed and thorough than what I'll be showing you here. And some are even more simple than what I've suggested here. But I just wanted to give you an overview of what you might do. So for the affirmative, the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, what is the problem in the status quo the proposition seeks to redress? So we talked about this here with policy about offering remote learning. Maybe my problem is disability, or maybe my problem is just that higher education is not as accessible as it should be, or maybe my problem is that education isn't as good as it could be. It could be something really broad or really specific. It's up to you how you want to present that problem. The next thing you're going to say is, how does the plan that we are proposing address the problem? You could say, okay, yeah, it's really important that we're more accessible to people from different classes, and that's why we should have Zoom education. But maybe my opponent's like, why does it make it more accessible? It's still the same cost. You have to explain, why does this plan, having remote access for all classes, address the problem? Then you might think about, how is this plan feasible? So what are the problems potentially with implementing the plan? Someone might say, oh, on the other side, they might say, well, what are you going to do about chemistry labs? What are you going to do about all of these, about physical education? How are we going to have remote learning for all of these classes that really require being in person? Production classes, things like that. So you want to make sure that you're thinking really broadly about all of the potential exceptions to how your plan could be implemented, and not assume it's so obvious. And then you want to address those in your speech. The next one is, what are the additional benefits of the plan? So you might say, okay, even though we're addressing this problem, there's more to it than that. There are other reasons we could adopt this. It's not just that it makes things more accessible for people with disabilities. It's also that we get maybe more creative pedagogy. Maybe teachers and faculty have to adapt to keeping their class in a variety of modalities, and maybe that will make for better education all around, or something like that. And then finally, how do you address the potential drawbacks of the plan? That's pretty similar to the feasible one in the example that I gave. But sometimes the drawbacks are externalities, which let's say if we stopped giving humanitarian aid, if we go to the other one, if we stop giving humanitarian aid and instead we give debt relief, well, the humanitarian aid often comes in the form of food products. And so maybe this would contribute, as some people would say, to more hunger in the short term. So how are you going to address that if that's your policy? Okay. On the negative side, things are a little different. It's actually a little bit, you might say it's a little bit easier to be on the negative in a policy debate. But that's not really true. It's just you have a lot more options because you don't have the burden of solving a problem. Because one of the things you can say is, the problem isn't really a problem. Say, no, we don't need to do remote work for all of these different classes. Things were fine just the way they were. There's no problem. And I'm going to argue against the problem that the affirmative presented. Then the second thing you might think about is, Could this problem be solved without the plan? Maybe it'll just take care of itself. Maybe there are other things that are happening already in the status quo that are kind of moving along in this direction. So if people are really worried about the economies of the global south, and that's why they want to get rid of humanitarian aid, you might say, well, look, microloans are here, or there's all sorts of other kinds of things that are happening in the global south, urbanization and industrialization, that are going to solve this problem that you're worried about. So you should just leave it alone. Let it solve itself. The next thing you might say is, could it be solved more effectively or with less harm by another plan? So this is a little bit of a strange strategy, but sometimes people take it of saying, we actually think we agree that there's a problem, but we just want to present a different way of doing it. We think that there's a better plan. We do need to change something, yeah, but there's a different plan of how to do that. The next thing is, you could say that the plan that they're offering, sure, there's a problem. It's not going to solve itself. But we think that the plan that they are offering actually doesn't solve this problem. They think that if they get rid of humanitarian aid, this is going to help the economies of the global south. That's ridiculous. It's not going to help the economies. There's too little humanitarian aid. That's the problem. This problem is only, this solution, so-called solution, is only going to make the problem worse. And then finally, are there drawbacks worse than the solution? So you might say, yeah, sure. We recognize that all this dumping of agricultural product into largely agricultural economies in third world countries leads to price instability and leads to the immiseration of poor farmers. We're not saying this isn't a serious problem, but we just think that famine, taking food out of the mouths of poor children, is a lot worse than this kind of broad economic stimulus that they're hoping they might get out of this. So there's lots of different kinds of lines of argument that you have in the negative. You don't have to do all of these at once. In fact, it's probably not a good idea to do all of these at once. It's usually more effective to say, there really is no problem here, and my whole speech is going to be about why there's no problem, rather than say, there's really no problem, and yeah, we should do something else to solve the problem. Well, those kind of seem contradictory. But sometimes on the negative, you can take more than one of these approaches, whereas on the affirmative, you really always need to show that there's a problem, that you have a plan that makes sense, that can work, and that problem solves the plan. Maybe also does some other nice things. So that's a really brief overview for this video. Hopefully it helped you get a little bit of a better sense what we are doing when we are talking about debate, and look forward to a few more videos about this. And I will see you in class, or I'll see you at the YouTube channel. Take care.